Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a version of modern American life that looked efficient, cheerful, and wonderfully convenient on the surface, but underneath it carried a much stranger story about industry, anxiety, chemistry, family life, and the quiet remaking of the national diet. What seemed like progress in a box or a can was also a response to war, labor, suburban expansion, and a growing belief that technology could improve almost anything, even dinner. As always, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a quick like is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history, feel free to subscribe. Now, with that, let's ease into the America of the 1950s, where the future was being served at the dinner table. The processed food boom that changed America in the 1950s did not begin in the strictest sense in the 1950s. By the time post-war families were stacking canned soups in kitchen cupboards and sliding frozen dinners into newly celebrated freezers, many of the crucial ideas, techniques, and industrial systems were already decades old. Canning had been around since the 19th century. Milling, refining, preserving, and mass packaging were hardly new. Even the idea that industrial science might rescue the household from drudgery had been gathering force for generations. And yet the 1950s became the decisive decade not because Americans suddenly discovered processed food, but because a whole set of older developments finally fused together at exactly the right moment. That is often what makes a historical turning point difficult to see at first. It rarely arrives as a single invention or a single announcement. More often, it emerges when habits, technologies, businesses, and social pressures align so completely that everyday life begins to reorganize itself without much noise. A woman reaching for a cake mix, a child drinking an orange-flavored beverage from a bright new package, a father carving a neatly uniform loaf of factory bread. All of this could feel ordinary, even trivial, but in the aggregate it marked a profound change in how Americans understood food itself. Not simply where food came from, but what food was allowed to become. To modern eyes, it is tempting to treat the story as obvious from the beginning, as though one side stood for wholesome tradition and the other for artificial decline. But history is rarely so tidy, and the people living through it did not experience the matter as a morality play. For millions of Americans, processed food promised safety, consistency, cleanliness, saved time, lower waste, and relief from domestic labor that had long been exhausting and repetitive. It also seemed modern, and in the 1950s modernity carried enormous emotional weight. After depression, war, rationing, and uncertainty, the modern future was not just a style. It was a hope. That is where the deeper explanation begins. To understand why processed food expanded so dramatically in the United States after the Second World War, we have to look past the supermarket shelf and into a broader landscape of wartime industry, suburban home building, demographic change, advertising, refrigeration, transportation networks, and the redefinition of gendered household work. The boom made sense to people at the time, not because they were naive, but because the products answered real pressures. Some of those pressures were practical, others were emotional, and some were built into the very structure of post-war American life. The country that emerged from the war was unusually powerful, unusually productive, and unusually confident in large systems. Factories that had turned out military supplies, preserved rations, chemical compounds, and efficient packaging did not simply vanish once peace returned. Industrial expertise looked for peacetime outlets. Food manufacturing was one of the most promising. The war had demonstrated that science, logistics, and standardization could feed enormous numbers of people under difficult conditions. Shelf stability, portability, caloric density, and long distribution chains had all been matters of national urgency. Once those capabilities existed, it was only natural that corporations would adapt them to civilian markets. At the same time, the war had altered domestic expectations. Women had entered war work in large numbers, even though the post-war years would put intense cultural pressure on many of them to return to the home. That return, however, did not mean a return to older assumptions about endless kitchen labor. The cultural image of the ideal homemaker in the 1950s was curiously modernized. She was supposed to be devoted, organized, attractive, socially competent, child-focused, and efficient. She was asked to produce abundance but also ease. Meals still mattered deeply as markers of care and stability, yet the conditions of daily life were changing. Suburban households were often isolated from older kin networks. New appliances promised speed. Standards of cleanliness rose. Time became something to manage. In this setting, processed food was not merely sold as edible. It was sold as help. The American supermarket itself helped make that promise visible. Earlier generations had often purchased food through smaller shops, specialty counters, or more fragmented arrangements of delivery and neighborhood trade. But mid-century supermarkets created an entirely different sensory environment. Long aisles, branded packaging, bright labels, stacked abundance, and self-service choice encouraged a new relationship between consumer and product. Food was no longer only something wrapped by a butcher, weighed by a grocer, or recognized by touch and smell. Increasingly, it was something encountered through package design, slogans, claims of purity, and the authority of the label. This mattered more than it may seem. A package can do many kinds of work at once. It protects, identifies, standardizes, and reassures. But it also creates distance. The more food came mediated through cartons, cans, cellophane, and printed promises, the more Americans learned to trust industrial presentation instead of direct familiarity. A glossy box could imply hygiene. A sealed can could imply safety. Uniform slices of bread could imply scientific precision. None of this was entirely false. Industrial food really could reduce certain risks and inconsistencies. But the trade-off was subtle. Consumers were gaining reliability while losing visibility. Bread is a useful example because it sat at the center of American meals and because its transformation had already begun before the 1950s. Mechanized baking and pre-sliced loaves had changed the texture of everyday eating. White bread, soft and uniform, became one of the iconic foods of 20th century America. It was easy to store, easy to serve, easy to pack into school lunches, and easy to associate with modern cleanliness. Whole grains, rough textures, and local irregularity increasingly came to seem old-fashioned, even inferior to many buyers. The ideal loaf was pale, soft, and standardized. What had once been a sign of processing became, for many, a sign of quality. That reversal reveals something important about the age. Many Americans did not fear intervention in food. Quite the opposite. Intervention often represented expertise. Enrichment programs, for example, which restored certain vitamins and minerals to refined flour, allowed manufacturers and public health advocates to present industrial food not only as convenient but as nutritionally improved. The language of science did not necessarily undermine trust. It often built it. In a society increasingly shaped by laboratories, engineering, and national campaigns for health, fortified could sound reassuring. The same logic extended across cereals, canned goods, dessert mixes, and beverages. Processing was often framed not as tampering, but as advancement. The product was more stable, more dependable, more modern, and sometimes more scientifically balanced than what it replaced. A housewife was not being asked to settle for less. She was being invited to choose wisely, rationally, and efficiently for her family. Advertising was very careful on this point. It did not usually say abandon care. It said express care through better tools. And advertising in the 1950s was becoming extraordinarily powerful at translating industrial output into intimate domestic language. Food companies did not simply market calories. They marketed relief, competence, popularity, maternal success, and social belonging. A boxed dessert was never just a boxed dessert. It was a smoother evening, a happier child, a compliment from guests, a husband pleased by domestic order. The emotional burden placed on women in these campaigns was heavy, even when wrapped in pastel-ease. They were told that the good home could be produced more cleanly and more attractively through branded solutions. Yet there was an irony at the center of all this. The more convenience foods were supposed to reduce labor, the more they often raised expectations around presentation and consistency. A meal assembled partly from processed components might be faster, but it also had to look right, fit social ideals, and signal that the household was keeping pace with the times. Convenience did not abolish pressure. It reorganized it. One of the most revealing products of the era was the cake mix. On paper, it offered liberation. Ingredients were measured. Failure seemed less likely. Baking, once dependent on skill, judgment, and patience, appeared newly accessible. But early reactions showed that convenience could be psychologically complicated. Some women reportedly felt that mixes made success too mechanical, as though an important element of domestic effort had disappeared. Food companies responded by adjusting formulas and marketing, sometimes leaving tasks like adding fresh eggs to restore a sense of participation. It was a small but telling accommodation. Consumers wanted ease, but not total detachment. They still wished to feel that the cake, in some meaningful sense, came from them. That small detail opens a wider question. How far could food be industrialized before it ceased to feel like food made for the family and became merely product? The 1950s did not answer that question once and for all, but it pushed the boundary much farther than before. Frozen food, in particular, carried a special aura of the future. Freezing technology had improved. Home refrigerators with freezer compartments became more common. Suburban shopping patterns favored bulk buying and storage. Frozen vegetables, frozen fish sticks, frozen desserts, and eventually the frozen dinner all fitted the rhythms of a household built around cars, appliances, and planned shopping trips rather than daily market visits. Freezing also preserved color and shape in ways that seemed impressive. Here was a form of preservation that looked cleaner and more modern than the old image of the cellar jar or heavily salted barrel. The frozen dinner would become one of the era's most memorable symbols, though its significance is sometimes exaggerated in hindsight. Not every family suddenly abandoned shared cooking for aluminum trays, and many households used convenience foods selectively rather than absolutely. Still, the popularity of these meals mattered because they condensed so many mid-century desires into a single object. They were portioned, efficient, easy to heat, and visually organized into neat compartments. Turkey here, potatoes there, vegetables in place, perhaps even dessert. It was mass production rendered as supper. There was something quietly beautiful about the sales pitch, at least from the perspective of the age. A complete meal, prepared by industry, requiring little more than heat and timing. A household could consume order itself. The appeal was practical, but it was also imaginative. The future, in the 1950s, was often imagined as a world in which complexity disappeared behind smooth surfaces. One pressed a button, opened a package, or trusted the machine. Processed food fit perfectly into that mental world. It belonged to the same ethos as the washing machine, the vacuum cleaner, and the promise that modern family life could be made smoother through systems. And yet one of the quiet contradictions of the age is that the more life was systematized, the more the kitchen remained a place where emotional meaning accumulated. Meals still carried the burden of memory and care. A mother was not simply delivering nutrients. She was staging normality. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, when public rhetoric often contrasted secure American abundance with foreign scarcity or ideological regimentation, the family table became a small theater of national confidence. To provide plentiful food was not just a private achievement. It resonated with broader cultural themes about prosperity, stability, and the success of the American way of life. This is one reason the processed food boom cannot be understood only through economics or technology. It also drew strength from ideology. The United States in the 1950s was unusually invested in the idea that capitalism could be seen, touched, and tasted in everyday abundance. Supermarket shelves became a kind of civic display. The number of choices themselves seemed meaningful. A long aisle of soups, cereals, desserts, crackers, and canned fruits could imply more than mere consumption. It could suggest freedom, progress, and national achievement. In that setting, industrial food production did not look like a compromise. It looked like victory. Television deepened this effect. As more households gathered around the screen, advertising gained access to the domestic imagination with unprecedented regularity. Food commercials did not have to prove that hunger existed. They only had to shape preferences, anxieties, and ideals. They could insert branded solutions directly into the emotional texture of family life. A product might be linked to happy children, tidy kitchens, competent mothers, relaxed evenings, or holiday success. The message was often calm and reassuring rather than aggressive. Use this soup in the recipe. Trust this gelatin. Serve this dessert. Save time without losing affection. The language was intimate, but the scale behind it was enormous. Children, too, became increasingly important in this new food order. Not because children had suddenly acquired power they had never possessed, but because the post-war boom had created a vast youth market and because advertisers understood that family habits could be anchored early. Sweetened cereals, snack products, flavored drinks, and novelty desserts were often presented in ways that linked industrial food with excitement, reward, and modern childhood itself. A child growing up in this environment encountered food not only through taste and family routine, but through branding, mascots, jingles, and package recognition. Desire could now be cultivated before the product even reached the bowl. This changed family negotiations in subtle ways. Parents, especially mothers, were still expected to regulate health, thrift, and propriety. Yet they were doing so in a marketplace increasingly designed to court children directly. The result was not total surrender to impulse, of course. Many families remained strict about meals, portions, and expense. But the terms of pressure had changed. Food companies were no longer simply supplying staples. They were helping define what children would ask for, what counted as a treat, and what a modern, caring parent might be expected to provide. There was also a deeper economic story underneath the bright packages. Post-war agriculture in the United States was itself becoming more mechanized, more productive, and more entangled with industrial supply chains. Farm output rose, and the relationship between raw agricultural goods and processed consumer products grew tighter. Corn, wheat, soy, dairy, and meat did not move directly from field to table in a simple line. They increasingly passed through a chain of processors, refiners, packagers, transport systems, and marketers. The value, and often the profit, shifted away from the raw ingredient alone and toward what could be done to it. That distinction matters. A tomato is one thing. Tomato soup in a branded can, with a recipe suggestion on the label and a familiar logo in the pantry, is another. Grain as a crop is one thing. Grain reshaped into breakfast cereal, snack crackers, cake flour, or enriched bread is another. The processed food boom was not just about preserving foods longer. It was about creating more stages in which industry could alter, brand, and sell them. In that sense, the boom represented not merely a culinary change but a commercial deepening. More of the food dollar flowed through corporate transformation. This did not happen in a vacuum. Government policy, scientific institutions, and corporate research all played roles in legitimizing and supporting the system. Nutrition science was developing, though not always in ways later generations would admire without qualification. The focus on vitamins, calories, and deficiency diseases could be useful, even life-saving in some contexts. But it could also encourage a fragmented view of food, in which the presence of certain measurable nutrients helped certify products that were otherwise deeply altered. If a cereal was fortified, if a loaf was enriched, if a beverage contained added vitamins, these features could serve as powerful reassurance. The whole question of overall dietary pattern could fade behind the authority of specific nutritional claims. This is not to say the science was fraudulent. Often it was earnest, partial, and shaped by the knowledge available at the time. That is precisely what makes the story more historically interesting. Mid-century Americans were not simply tricked by labels. Many were participating in a genuine cultural moment in which science seemed capable of identifying and correcting deficiencies in a rational way. The language of fortified foods emerged in a world where deficiency diseases had been serious concerns, where wartime nutrition had mattered, and where public health increasingly relied on measurable standards. A food product could therefore appear both industrial and benevolent. Meanwhile, the chemistry of food itself was becoming a more visible terrain of innovation. Emulsifiers, stabilizers, preservatives, colorants, texturizers, and flavoring agents were not necessarily household words, but the effects of such ingredients were felt everywhere. Cake stayed softer, bread lasted longer, ice cream remained smoother, packaged foods held their shape, color, and texture with greater reliability. Again, from the perspective of the consumer in the 1950s, this could look like evidence of progress. Spoilage had long been a serious domestic problem. Seasonal limits had long constrained menus. If science could make food last, travel, and behave more obediently, that seemed to solve real problems. But every solution reorganizes the world around it. Once a family becomes accustomed to food that stores for longer, travels farther, and appears more stable, the infrastructure of life shifts accordingly. Shopping can be less frequent. Menus can become less seasonal. Expectations of appearance can harden. National brands can displace local producers. Regional differences can blur. And perhaps most quietly of all, the consumer's skill set can change. Knowledge once necessary for preserving, judging, adapting, and making do in the kitchen becomes less central when industry performs more of those tasks upstream. This point deserves care because it can be romanticized too easily. Earlier domestic labor was hard, repetitive, and often physically tiring. Many women would have welcomed any tool that reduced the hours spent peeling, canning, boiling, mixing, or worrying over waste. It would be a mistake to imagine the pre-processed kitchen as a peaceful realm of authenticity. Often it was simply labor-intensive. Still, the transfer of that labor out of the home and into industrial systems came with cultural consequences. Skills were not only saved. Some were lost or at least used less frequently. Dependence shifted from household practice toward purchased reliability. The food industry was keenly aware that reliability itself could be sold as comfort. Recipes on packages played an important role here. They taught consumers how to use processed foods not as exceptions, but as bases for normal cooking. A can of soup became a sauce. A boxed mix became the foundation for baking. Gelatin became an ingredient in molded salads and desserts that now seem strangely emblematic of the period. This was a particularly clever strategy because it avoided presenting processed food as a complete replacement for home cooking. Instead, it positioned industrial products as partners in cooking. A woman could still feel that she was preparing dinner, while the product quietly did more of the hidden work. The casseroles and molded dishes that appeared so frequently in mid-century American kitchens are revealing for that reason. To later generations, Some of them seem almost comical. Combinations of canned soup, packaged noodles, processed cheese, canned vegetables, crushed crackers, or fruit suspended in gelatin. But viewed in context, they make practical and cultural sense. They were economical, scalable, transportable to church suppers and neighborhood gatherings, and highly compatible with shelf-stable ingredients. They could be assembled without constant fresh shopping. They looked orderly. They reflected a world in which hospitality itself was being adapted to industrial convenience. And here the social life of food becomes especially important. The 1950s were not simply about the private nuclear family eating in isolation, despite the power of that image. There were also potlucks, bridge clubs, church events, school functions, and neighborhood gatherings, especially in new suburban communities trying to create social bonds from scratch. Processed food often made these forms of sociability easier. It provided ingredients that were affordable, dependable, and recognizable. A dish made from branded components could travel well, serve many, and align with popular tastes. Convenience was not only about the private burden of labor. It also helped sustain a whole new social architecture. At the same time, labor within the food industry itself was becoming less visible to the consumer. The gleaming package concealed factory lines, chemical formulation, large-scale procurement, and increasingly complex corporate organization. This invisibility helped processed food appear almost magically efficient. The work had not vanished. It had moved. It was performed by agricultural laborers, transport workers, machinists, chemists, factory employees, advertisers, packaging designers, and many others. Yet the household experienced the end product chiefly as saved time. That is one of the signature illusions of modern consumption. Effort disappears from sight not because it no longer exists, but because it has been displaced elsewhere. The same can be said of waste. Packaging made convenience possible, but it also multiplied disposable materials. Metal cans, cardboard boxes, glass containers, waxed papers, plastic elements, and foil all expanded with the processed food system. In the 1950s, this was often celebrated rather than lamented. Disposable culture symbolized freedom from scrubbing, reusing, and mending. Throwing something away could feel luxurious because it meant one had enough. Yet this, too, was part of the larger transformation. The processed food boom encouraged Americans to accept a food economy in which abundance was increasingly tied to single-use materials and constant replacement. If all of this sounds inevitable in hindsight, it did not necessarily feel so in the moment. There were concerns, hesitations, and critics. Some nutritionists worried about over-refinement. Some consumers distrusted unfamiliar products. Some people still preferred the taste of less processed foods, or remained attached to regional and ethnic traditions that did not fit neatly into mass-market packaging. The boom was real, but it was not uncontested. What made it powerful was that its supporters had the larger cultural wind at their backs. They could link their products to convenience, progress, modern design, and post-war optimism. Their critics often sounded, fairly or unfairly, like people resisting the future. And yet, beneath the confidence of the age, certain tensions were already beginning to gather. The very success of processed food made Americans more dependent on invisible systems of production and distribution. It normalized diets built around refined ingredients. It rewarded foods that could be engineered most effectively for shelf life and scale. It placed ever more interpretive power in the hands of advertisers and manufacturers. For a while, these developments were buffered by prosperity, novelty, and trust in institutions. But those buffers would not remain equally strong forever. Because once a nation begins to eat through industry at this scale, the next question is not only what appears on the shelf, but what happens to agriculture, health, taste, and even memory when industrial logic begins to shape the entire chain from field to family table. That shaping of the chain from field to family table was one of the most consequential and least visible features of the processed food boom. By the late 1950s, the American diet was not simply changing at the point of purchase. It was being reorganized much earlier in the decisions farmers made about what to grow, in the contracts processors offered, in the machinery manufacturers sold, and in the incentives that favored certain crops over others. Industrial food did not begin in the supermarket. It began in a system that increasingly rewarded uniform raw materials that could be transformed efficiently, shipped widely, and sold at scale. Uniformity, in this sense, was not merely a visual preference. It was an economic requirement. A factory line works best when ingredients behave predictably. A canning operation wants peas of similar size, tomatoes of similar texture, fruits that can be processed on schedule, grains that mill consistently, and fats that remain stable in storage. The more food was drawn into industrial processing, the more agriculture itself felt pressure to supply materials suited to standardization. This did not erase older patterns overnight, but it did encourage a different relationship between farm and market. Diversity could become an inconvenience. Irregularity could become inefficiency. That is part of why the processed food boom was never only about taste or convenience. It was about the spread of industrial logic across landscapes that had once been more visibly seasonal, local, and variable. Americans had always altered their food, of course. They had preserved, cured, milled, fermented, baked, and canned for generations. But the post-war era intensified something distinct: the integration of farming, science, transport, manufacturing, advertising, and domestic routine into one increasingly seamless commercial system. Once that system matured, it could shape appetite almost as effectively as it responded to it. A useful example lies in the story of fats and oils, because here the 1950s sat in the middle of an important transition. Traditional cooking fats had long included butter, lard, and drippings saved in the kitchen. But industrial food manufacturing favored fats that could be processed in large quantities, stabilized, and used consistently in baked goods, snack products, frying, and shelf-stable items. Hydrogenated vegetable shortenings and related industrial fats had already entered American life earlier in the century, but their wider integration into processed food culture accelerated in the post-war decades. They worked well. That was the crucial point. They were functional. They could help create the texture, durability, and convenience the new system demanded. To later generations, aware of later controversies, it can be tempting to read this development as a simple case of obvious error. But for people at the time, the picture was less clear. Industrial fats could be marketed as modern, clean, economical, and even, in some settings, scientifically preferable to older animal-based alternatives. They fitted the broader pattern of the age, where intervention and refinement often carried prestige. The deeper lesson is not merely that people were mistaken. It is that a technological society tends to trust ingredients that solve practical problems first, and only later ask what other consequences may come attached to that convenience. Sugar followed a related, though somewhat different, path. Refined sugar was hardly new to American life in the 1950s, but processed food gave it more pathways into the day. It appeared not only in desserts but in cereals, canned fruits, beverages, sauces, and a widening array of snacks and convenience foods. Sweetness had always held emotional value, especially in a culture that linked treats with comfort, hospitality, and reward. Yet, industrial manufacturing magnified sugar's usefulness. It improved flavor, aided preservation, shaped texture, and encouraged repeat consumption. It also paired beautifully with branding. A sweet product was easier to market as pleasure, especially to children. And so sweetness became more ambient. It no longer belonged only to the clearly marked territory of dessert. It drifted into breakfast, into packaged drinks, into foods that seemed ordinary enough not to require much reflection. That, too, is how historical change often works. What would once have stood out as indulgence begins to feel normal when distributed across many small moments. A spoonful here, a glass there, a cereal bowl in the morning, a snack in the afternoon. The extraordinary softens into routine. Salt, meanwhile, remained one of industry's quiet allies. It preserved, seasoned, stabilized, and made standardized foods more appealing. Like sugar and industrial fats, it served practical needs inside large-scale production. None of these ingredients became central merely because manufacturers were careless about health. They became central because they solved multiple industrial problems at once. They were cheap, effective, and adaptable. That is precisely why they spread so widely. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the 1950s processed food boom. The foods that came to dominate were not simply those that tasted pleasant or looked modern. They were those that aligned most neatly with the requirements of processing, storage, transport, marketing, and predictable consumer response. Once millions of people were eating within that framework, taste itself began to bend. People came to prefer what the system could reliably make. The system, in turn, expanded around those preferences. Cause and effect became difficult to separate. The freezer offers another good example of this mutual shaping. To own a refrigerator with a capable freezer, or even a separate freezer unit, altered more than storage capacity. Changed planning. It changed shopping frequency. It changed the imagined distance between purchase and use. Frozen orange juice concentrate, frozen vegetables, frozen meats, frozen pies, and ready-made meals all became part of a household strategy built around preserving future convenience. A person standing in a supermarket was no longer choosing only for today or tomorrow. They were stocking a controlled domestic reserve. That reserve carried psychological comfort. Post-war America, despite all its confidence, was still a society close enough to the memory of depression and wartime rationing to value security in material form. A full freezer, like a stocked pantry, signaled preparedness. Processed food thrived in part because it converted abundance into visible household stability. Food that lasted longer could reassure. It turned purchasing power into stored certainty. The kitchen became a small vault of modern plenty. And because the products lasted, they also traveled more easily through the new retail world. The rise of interstate trucking, cold chain logistics, and large-scale distribution meant that foods no longer had to depend so heavily on local growing seasons or nearby production. A national market could push national brands into daily life with growing force. Regional differences did not disappear, but they came under pressure from this expanding sameness. Children in different parts of the country might begin eating the same cereals, recognizing the same wrappers, asking for the same canned or frozen items by name. Processed food helped knit the nation together through repetition, though at the price of flattening some local distinctions. This flattening was subtle because it rarely felt like loss at first. It often felt like access. Here was fruit beyond its old season, meals with less preparation, snacks that survived the lunchbox, breads that stayed soft, soups ready at hand, desserts that seemed almost guaranteed to succeed. The very things that standardized the national diet also made it more widely available in forms many people found useful or pleasurable. Convenience could be democratic in that sense. It offered a version of abundance that was not reserved only for the wealthy or for those with servants, extended households, or endless hours for domestic work. That democratic promise should not be dismissed. In earlier generations, the ideal of a varied, polished, and low-labor table had often depended on hidden labor or substantial privilege. Mid-century food processing claimed to distribute some portion of that comfort more broadly. A family of modest means could buy canned peaches, packaged pudding, factory bread, and ready-made soup and feel that they, too, were participating in modern prosperity. For many households, this was not an illusion but a tangible improvement over harder, narrower routines. The processed food boom carried real convenience precisely because it drew on real industrial capacity. Yet convenience was never equally shared in its benefits or its burdens. Women remained the main managers of household food in the dominant cultural model, and so they stood at the center of both the promise and the tension. The advertisements implied release from drudgery, but they also reinforced responsibility. The modern wife and mother was expected to be efficient without seeming lazy, frugal without seeming deprived, attentive without seeming anxious, and modern without becoming impersonal. Processed food could help her meet those demands, yet it could also expose her to judgment. Too much reliance on ready-made items might appear careless. Too little might seem backward or needlessly laborious. This balancing act produced a particularly mid-century style of domestic compromise. Many women did not stop cooking. They assembled, extended, and improved. They used canned soup in sauces, packaged pudding in pies, frozen vegetables in casseroles, and mixes as foundations rather than complete solutions. The meal on the table could still be described as homemade, even if much of its underlying structure came from industry. This was one reason processed food penetrated so deeply. It did not require Americans to abandon all older food values at once. It could inhabit those values, mimic them, and gradually redefine them from within. The distinction between homemade and factory-made therefore became increasingly blurred. A family dessert could begin in a box but still be served with pride. A holiday side dish could rely on canned ingredients yet feel festive and sincere. A lunch might contain factory bread, processed cheese, packaged cookies, and canned fruit, while still being understood as care embodied in a neat container. Industrial food did not necessarily destroy emotional meaning. Often it borrowed emotional meaning and learned to wear it convincingly. This is what made the system so durable. It did not merely sell products. It inserted itself into affection, habit, thrift, aspiration, and social performance. Once that happens, critique becomes harder. To question processed food was not simply to question an ingredient list. It was, in some cases, to question the labor-saving tools on which families depended, the status symbols of modern domestic life, and the post-war optimism that had been built into everyday consumption. At the same time, certain foods became more than foods. They became symbols of a period style. Gelatin salads, canned pineapple rings, marshmallow-topped casseroles, powdered drink mixes, individually wrapped slices, and television trays carrying compartmentalized meals all now appear, in hindsight, almost as visual shorthand for mid-century America. But to reduce them to oddity would miss their importance. These objects reveal how a society imagined order, hospitality, novelty, and practicality. They show what people believed technology should do for daily life. They show what counted as modern enough to admire. Even the aesthetics of processed food deserve attention. Mid-century packaging often used clean fonts, bright colors, cheerful domestic scenes, and a careful balance between science and comfort. The message was not merely that the product was efficient. It was that efficiency itself could be attractive and civilizing. A shelf of neatly labeled cans or boxes conveyed the same emotional order as a tidy kitchen. The supermarket display and the domestic cupboard reflected each other. Both promised that life could be smoothed into manageable units. If there was a faint unease beneath this polish, it often surfaced indirectly. Some people worried that food had become too soft, too uniform, too detached from real ingredients. Others joked about the strangeness of certain modern recipes. Some still held on to gardening, canning, baking, or regional traditions partly as enjoyment and partly as quiet resistance to total standardization. But these hesitations existed within a broader cultural current that still favored the new system. The processed food boom was not driven by ignorance of all alternatives. It was driven by the fact that industrial foods solved enough immediate problems and fitted enough cherished ideals to outweigh unease for the time being. And then there was medicine. During the 1950s, the relationship between diet and chronic disease was only beginning to become a matter of broader public concern in the form it later would. Infectious disease, deficiency, sanitation, and food safety had long shaped public health thinking. Chronic illnesses certainly existed, but the way nutrition would later be discussed in connection with heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and ultra-processed diets had not yet fully entered ordinary public understanding. This mattered enormously. It meant that the most visible questions around food were still often about adequacy, convenience, taste, and modern management rather than long-term metabolic patterns. In other words, the processed food boom unfolded in an environment where its immediate advantages were obvious, while many of its later costs were still diffuse, debated, or not yet clearly framed. That asymmetry helps explain how quickly the system could entrench itself. Societies are often very good at adopting innovations whose benefits are immediate and whose drawbacks emerge slowly, unevenly, or invisibly. A can opener in the hand, a quicker supper, a reliable lunchbox staple, a child happy with breakfast before school. These are concrete experiences. A gradual reorientation of national health is much harder to perceive from inside the moment. There is another irony here. The same faith in science that helped legitimize processed food would later help expose some of its problems. But in the 1950s, science still largely stood beside industry in the public imagination as a partner in progress. Laboratories improved formulas. Chemists solved spoilage. Nutrition experts advised on fortification. Engineers improved packaging and freezing. Very little about this arrangement necessarily appeared sinister to ordinary consumers. On the contrary, it looked like evidence that modern institutions were doing exactly what they should do, making life safer, easier, and more efficient. This helps us understand why processed food in the 1950s became not just common but respectable. Respectability matters in history more than novelty. A new product can be curious for a season. A respectable one settles into ritual. By the end of the decade, many processed foods had crossed that threshold. They were no longer just symbols of innovation. They were part of birthdays, school mornings, church suppers, office breaks, picnics, and weeknight dinners. The industrial diet was no longer waiting at the edge of American life. It had moved indoors, taken a place at the table, and learned the rhythms of the household. And once that happened, the next stage of the story could begin. Because in the 1960s and beyond, the country would not simply continue eating processed foods in the same way. The scale would grow, the science would shift, the criticisms would sharpen, and the emotional meaning of convenience itself would begin to change as Americans started to notice what had quietly been built around them. That changing meaning of convenience is one of the most revealing threads to follow, because it shows how quickly a society can move from gratitude for a solution to unease about the world that solution has created. In the early post-war decades, convenience had sounded almost purely benevolent. It meant relief from drudgery, rescue from waste, and participation in a brighter, more efficient future. But as the 1960s gathered pace, convenience began to feel more complicated. It still promised save time, of course, but Americans were now living inside the long-term consequences of the systems built in the 1950s. The supermarket was bigger. The freezer was fuller. The branded shelf was more crowded. The processed option was no longer a novelty helping the household from the outside. It was becoming the environment itself. This shift mattered because a tool can be judged one way when used occasionally and another when it becomes the structure of daily life. A canned soup used now and then to simplify supper is one thing. A whole domestic food system increasingly built on industrial formulations, standardized snacks, refined grains, engineered fats, and heavily branded child-targeted products is another. By the 1960s, the United States was moving further into that second condition. Convenience had ceased to be a supplement. It was becoming an expectation. And expectations, once established, begin to reorganize behavior in ways that are hard to reverse. When a family grows accustomed to meals that require less preparation, breakfasts that can be poured from a box, desserts that come nearly assembled, and snacks that need no season, no peeling, no waiting, then time itself is reinterpreted. Delay begins to feel inconvenient rather than normal. Cooking from basic ingredients may still occur, but it must now justify its effort against a background of easier alternatives. The question is no longer simply, what shall we eat, but also, how much labor is reasonable to ask of an ordinary day? That question became even sharper as American family life shifted again. The 1950s ideal of the full-time suburban homemaker, though culturally dominant in imagery, had never described everyone. By the 1960s and into the 1970s, the realities of women's paid work, changing aspirations, rising costs, and broader social transformation made the older domestic script harder to sustain as a universal norm even in imagination. Processed food, which had once been marketed as an aid to the efficient housewife, could now be absorbed into a new story, the meal solution for a faster, more crowded, more fragmented life. The same industrial system that had been built to support mid-century domestic order proved flexible enough to thrive in a less orderly age. This is one reason the processed food boom that changed America in the 1950s did not remain a story about the 1950s alone. The decade mattered because it established legitimacy, infrastructure, and habit. But the decades that followed would test how deeply those habits could spread once family routines, work patterns, and cultural values changed further. And spread they did. The food industry was no longer merely offering preserved or pre-prepared versions of familiar dishes. It was increasingly designing new categories of eating altogether. Snacks for the car, meals for the microwave, drinks for instant refreshment, foods divided into portion identities for children, athletes, dieters, office workers, and late-night consumers. The very idea of a meal began to loosen. That loosening is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to underestimate how significant it was. Traditional meal structures, even when imperfectly observed, once imposed a certain rhythm on the day. Breakfast, dinner, supper, perhaps lunch carried expectations about timing, setting, and composition. Processed food did not destroy that rhythm instantly, but it made it easier to eat outside it. Individually packaged items, shelf-stable snacks, sweetened beverages, and ready-made foods encouraged more frequent, less ceremonial eating. One could consume calories in transit between tasks in front of the television, at the desk, from the vending machine, or alone. What industry gained by making food more portable and durable, it also encouraged by making eating less anchored to shared domestic time. Television again played a central role here, not only through advertising but through the way it changed evening life. The television dinner has become almost a cliché of mid-century America, but it endures as an image because it captured something real. The television set did not simply provide entertainment. It reoriented the room. Furniture arrangements changed. Tension changed. The evening meal, once more firmly attached to the table as a household focal point, could now migrate toward screens. This did not happen everywhere at once, and families often worried about it, resisted it, or regulated it. Still, the symbolic force was unmistakable. Food increasingly adapted to media, rather than the other way around. That adaptation would intensify with the arrival of new appliances. The microwave oven, initially expensive and unfamiliar, would later become one of the most transformative domestic technologies in modern eating. It is impossible to understand the later evolution of processed food without it. The microwave did not merely heat food faster. It encouraged manufacturers to engineer foods specifically for rapid reheating, portion control, and textural resilience under that method. Entire categories of frozen and packaged meals would be refined to cooperate with the machine. Here again, domestic technology and industrial food design moved together. The kitchen appliance was not just a passive tool waiting for consumers. It became part of a larger system through which industry could shape what counted as practical food. At the same time, the language surrounding processed food began to change in revealing ways. The 1950s vocabulary of modernity and scientific improvement remained present, but it was joined by a new emphasis on speed, flexibility, and lifestyle fit. The successful product was no longer simply hygienic, reliable, and forward-looking. It was also quick, portable, fun, and compatible with increasingly fragmented schedules. Packaging grew more targeted. Segmentation deepened. The market learned to speak not only to the generic family but to age groups, moods, and occasions. Eating could now be customized by identity in ways earlier food economies had found harder to monetize. Children remained especially important. In fact, the post-war strategy of creating taste loyalty early became even more sophisticated over time. Bright cereals, snack cakes, crackers, fruit-flavored drinks, puddings, and convenience lunches were refined not merely to satisfy children but to produce specific forms of desire. Surprise, collectability, sweetness calibrated for repetition, textures engineered for easy liking, packaging that could travel and display itself. The child consumer of the 1960s and 1970s was moving through a world where the industrial imagination no longer stopped at making food available. It now worked actively to shape appetite, expectation, and emotional association from the first years of life onward. Parents, meanwhile, were asked to navigate an increasingly contradictory landscape. On one hand, a good parent was still expected to provide nourishment, regularity, and care. On the other, the same parent was now surrounded by products promising joy, efficiency, and relief, often backed by nutritional claims or implicit approval from modern science. The lunchbox offers a small but revealing example. Once filled more simply and locally, it increasingly became a destination for individually wrapped products, factory bread, processed meats, sweetened items, and shelf-stable snacks. The lunchbox was efficient, portable, sanitary, and visually orderly. It also carried the larger transformation inside a child's daily routine. In many ways, this was the triumph of the processed food system at its most intimate. It no longer needed to conquer special occasions or win over the reluctant adult with grand promises of technological progress. It had settled into ordinary repetition. School days, work breaks, television hours, road trips, after-school hunger, hurried mornings, solitary lunches. All of these became opportunities for industry-designed foods to feel natural. Repetition did the rest. A person raised on standard flavors, soft textures, and the reliable sweetness or saltiness of mass products might later prefer them not because they had been fooled, but because they had become familiar comforts. This is where memory enters the story. Processed food did not only change American health debates or supermarket economics. It also reshaped nostalgia. Many foods that later generations would criticize on nutritional grounds remained beloved because they were bound to childhood, family routine, or the emotional architecture of a particular era. A canned soup casserole might be remembered through winter kitchens and church dinners. A boxed macaroni meal might be linked to hurried comfort. A sweet cereal might carry the glow of Saturday morning television. These emotional attachments gave processed food a powerful defense. Criticism aimed at ingredients or industry could sound, to some listeners, like criticism of memory itself. And yet criticism did grow. It did not arrive all at once, and it rarely came from a single ideological direction. Some critics worried about additives, colorings, preservatives, and artificial flavors. Others objected to the decline of culinary skill or the loss of regional food traditions. Some focused on public health, especially as chronic disease research expanded and debates over fat, sugar, and refined foods became more visible. Environmental concerns would add another layer, especially as disposable packaging and industrial agriculture came under greater scrutiny. By the late 20th century, processed food had become not only a celebrated achievement of modern abundance, but also a target for suspicion, reform, and cultural backlash. Still, the critique often struggled against one stubborn fact: the system worked remarkably well on its own terms. It fed millions efficiently. It reduced some forms of labor. It offered long shelf life, predictable flavor, and wide availability. It created profitable national brands and transformed retailing. It adapted easily to changing family structures and work patterns. Even when attacked, it could reinvent itself. Lower-fat versions appeared. High-fiber versions appeared. Natural branding emerged. Organic versions of processed products arrived. The system learned to absorb dissatisfaction and sell it back in revised packaging. That ability to adapt is one reason the history cannot be told as a simple rise and fall. The processed food boom did not peak and then disappear once criticism emerged. Rather, it diversified, defended itself, and changed shape. Some companies leaned harder into indulgence. Others leaned into health claims. Some sold convenience as liberation. Others sold restraint, fortification, or purity. But underneath these shifting messages remained the deeper structure first consolidated in the 1950s. Food as an industrial product designed for storage, branding, transport, convenience, and mass preference formation. Even the language of natural would eventually become entangled with this inheritance. A packaged food could now be marketed as close to nature, artisanal in feeling, or health-conscious, even while remaining part of the same large-scale system of processing, distribution, and consumer management. In other words, once industrial food became normal, resistance to it could also be industrialized. The supermarket could accommodate criticism by creating new shelves, new labels, new aesthetic cues. The structure remained. The story around it shifted. Meanwhile, the geography of eating continued to evolve. Fast food, though a related rather than identical phenomenon, flourished within the same broad historical environment. Standardization, industrial sourcing, consistency across distance, rapid service, and branded trust all harmonized with the culture that processed food had helped normalize. The hamburger chain, the drive-through, the fried item in a paper wrapper, these belong to the same expanding logic in which food should be reliable, scalable, and available with minimal friction. The home pantry and the roadside counter were different spaces, but they drew strength from common assumptions about efficiency and sameness. It is also important to notice how class shaped the later reputation of processed food. As culinary culture diversified and as some affluent consumers gained access to more celebrated fresh produce, specialty markets, and restaurant experiences, heavily processed foods could begin to acquire a new social meaning. What had once symbolized modern sophistication might now, in some circles, be treated as low status, unhealthy, or culturally unsophisticated. Yet this shift often overlooked the historical reasons those foods had spread in the first place. Convenience was not a shallow preference floating free of real life. It had always been bound to labor, time, income, transport, family structure, and domestic expectation. This makes moral judgment difficult, and history is better for resisting easy purity. The woman stretching canned goods into a weeknight meal, the parent choosing packaged lunch items, the worker eating industrial snacks on a short break, the child requesting the cereal made famous by advertisements. These people were not merely passive victims of manipulation. They were moving through systems that had been built to make certain choices attractive, affordable, and culturally legible. Their choices often made sense within the constraints they faced. That is one of the central truths the processed food story reveals. The modern diet is not just about individual will. It is about infrastructure. Infrastructure may sound like a dry word, but in this case it is intimate. It includes roads, trucking routes, supermarket layouts, refrigeration, packaging science, agricultural subsidies, kitchen appliances, work schedules, school calendars, television programming, and the emotional burden of feeding a family day after day. Once all of those layers point in the same direction, a national diet can change with astonishing durability. The 1950s were the decade in which that direction became securely normalized in the United States. Later decades enlarged it, criticized it, modified it, and built arguments around it, but they rarely escaped its foundational logic. There is also a quieter cultural consequence that is easy to miss. As food became more standardized and more detached from visible production, many Americans lost regular contact with the physical realities behind eating. Seasonality faded from immediate awareness. Regional scarcity mattered less. The labor of preservation, butchery, milling, fermentation, and cultivation became more abstract to the average consumer. Food could appear almost as a finished language spoken fluently by brands. One selected among options, but often with limited knowledge of the systems that had produced those options in the first place. This distance had advantages, certainly. It reduced some old anxieties around spoilage and supply. It made urban and suburban life more comfortable. It gave families access to foods that once required much greater effort or privilege. But distance also made critique more difficult until larger crises or public debates forced attention back upstream. Only then do societies often begin asking where ingredients came from, why products are formulated as they are, who profits, which risks were hidden, and what older knowledge disappeared along the way. By the late 20th century, those questions would become harder to ignore. Journalists, nutrition reformers, environmental campaigners, public health officials, chefs, and ordinary consumers would begin pulling at different threads of the industrial food system. Some would focus on farm policy, some on additives, some on chronic disease, some on family mealtime, some on the corporate power of food giants, and some on the way children had been cultivated as a market. The resulting picture would be messy and contested, full of half-corrections, new fads, and competing claims of expertise. But all of that later argument depended on one earlier fact having already become true. Americans had learned, in the decades after the Second World War, to think of processed food not as an emergency substitute or an occasional novelty, but as a normal, respectable, and even intimate part of modern life. And once a society reaches that point, reversal is never simple. What follows is not a clean rejection, but a long struggle over reform, memory, convenience, and the uneasy question of how much of the industrial diet people are willing or able to leave behind as the 20th century gives way to something even faster. That uneasy question of how much of the industrial diet people were willing or able to leave behind became even harder to answer once the late 20th century accelerated nearly every condition that had made processed food so attractive. In the first place, by then, convenience was no longer just a domestic preference shaped by post-war suburbia. It had become woven into commuting patterns, dual-income households, school schedules, office culture, televised leisure, and a consumer economy that increasingly rewarded speed above almost everything else. If the 1950s had normalized processed food as respectable modernity, the decades that followed made it structurally difficult to imagine everyday American life without it. One of the clearest signs of this shift was that the food industry no longer needed to persuade the public that industrial intervention was legitimate. That battle had largely been won. The new challenge was competition within abundance. Once shelves were full of ready-made options, companies had to fight for attention in subtler ways. Through health language, indulgence language, portability, portioning, novelty, texture, and branding that made one processed product feel somehow more suitable than another. This changed the tone of food marketing. In the 1950s, the promise had often been trust modern food science. Later, it became trust this particular version of convenience to fit your exact life. This is where the story grows especially revealing, because it shows how flexible industrial food culture could be. It could sell itself as efficient and practical, but also as playful. It could claim scientific authority, but also emotional comfort. It could present itself as disciplined, low-fat, fortified, high-fiber, protein-rich, natural-seeming, indulgent, child-friendly, adult-sophisticated, budget-conscious, or premium. That flexibility made the system extraordinarily resilient. Consumers could believe they were moving away from one kind of processed eating while still remaining well inside the broader industrial framework that had been built decades earlier. The word processed, after all, was never a very stable category in ordinary life. Almost all cooking involves some degree of processing. Bread is processed. Cheese is processed. Canning, milling, freezing, fermenting, and preserving all alter food. That ambiguity allowed manufacturers considerable room to maneuver. Criticism might land on certain additives or certain heavily engineered snack products, yet the larger system could respond by presenting other products as cleaner, simpler, or closer to nature while still relying on industrial agriculture, industrial packaging, industrial logistics, and industrial formulation. The line between reform and rebranding was often hard to see from the shopping cart. This helps explain why public concern about diet could rise dramatically without producing a simple return to older eating patterns. Consider the growth of diet culture, especially from the 1960s onward and then with increasing force in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. Americans were becoming more conscious of calories, body weight, cholesterol, sugar, and fat, though often in shifting and contradictory ways. Yet many of the solutions offered to this concern were themselves deeply processed. Low-fat yogurt sweetened and stabilized for shelf life, diet frozen meals portioned for control, reduced-calorie snacks engineered for guilt management, breakfast bars, shakes, powdered substitutes, and an expanding world of foods whose authority rested not on tradition but on nutritional calculation. In that sense, industrial food did not merely create a problem and then retreat. It helped define the language in which the problem would be managed. A consumer worried about health could still remain in close partnership with the very system that had normalized refined and packaged eating. The package would simply speak in a new accent. Instead of promising the future, it might promise restraint. Instead of household elegance, it might promise measurable wellness. Instead of indulgence without effort, it might promise virtue without inconvenience. But the underlying relationship between consumer and manufacturer often remained much the same. The supermarket reflected this layering beautifully. By the late 20th century, it had become less like a simple marketplace and more like a map of competing ideas about life itself. One aisle offered comfort, another discipline, another novelty, another nostalgia. Bright cereals stood near high-fiber cereals. Frozen indulgence stood near frozen dieting solutions. Sweetened drinks stood near fortified drinks. Packaging invited the shopper to navigate not merely hunger, but identity. Good parent, efficient worker, disciplined eater, generous host, health-conscious adult, budget survivor, child-pleasing provider. Processed food had become a language through which Americans managed not only mealtimes but also self-image. This is why later critiques often felt so charged. They were not only arguments about ingredients or public health statistics. They touched everyday dignity. Telling people they should eat less convenience food could sound, depending on context, like telling them they should have more time, more money, better transport, more stable schedules, better kitchens, or fewer daily pressures than they actually had. The critique was not always wrong, but it was often socially incomplete. History asks us to notice that diets are not merely chosen from principle. They are built from the shape of ordinary life. That shape kept changing. The rise of longer commutes, more individualized schedules, and more time spent outside the home made the ideal of the carefully prepared shared meal harder to sustain as a universal standard, even when it remained emotionally powerful. Food manufacturers responded with products for grazing, reheating, drinking, microwaving, carrying, stacking, freezing, and opening one-handed. The meal could be broken into components that required almost no preparation and minimal cleanup. This was enormously useful, especially for exhausted households. But it also continued the long drift away from food as a process visibly linked to season, locality, or sustained domestic craft. Fast food deserves another look here, because it did not simply grow beside supermarket processed food. The two worlds reinforced one another culturally. Both trained consumers to expect predictable taste, speed, and availability. Both relied on standardization across distance. Both leaned on food science, large-scale procurement, and the smoothing away of local irregularity. Even when people distinguished between eating out and what we keep at home, the expectations formed in one realm could influence the other. Children raised on highly standardized chain flavors might find more variable fresh foods comparatively unfamiliar or less immediately rewarding. Convenience became not just a logistical habit but a sensory habit. This sensory dimension is important and often underexplained. Industrial food systems do not only alter what is available, they shape what seems normal to the mouth. Softness, sweetness, crunch engineered for immediate satisfaction, salt calibrated for repeatability, flavors amplified to cut through distraction. These become more than traits. They become a kind of baseline. Once enough of the population has been raised on that baseline, reform becomes harder because it is no longer merely a matter of information. It is also a matter of taste memory. People do not simply compare nutrients. They compare familiarity, and familiarity often wins quietly. That may be one reason nostalgia around processed food has remained so durable even among people who otherwise speak critically about it. Certain boxed meals, canned dishes, snack cakes, powdered drinks, and packaged desserts evoke not only flavor but a whole vanished arrangement of life. A particular kitchen, a parent's routine, a grandparent's pantry, a holiday table assembled from recipes clipped out of magazines, a school lunch packed in wax paper, a road trip cooler, a television tray balanced in a softly lit living room. Industrial food often arrived as a substitute for labor, but over time it also became a container for memory. That made later rejection emotionally uneven, and the industry, keenly sensitive to memory, learned to market it. Vintage logos returned. Retro flavors were revived. Classic recipes were reissued. Packaging borrowed cues from earlier decades to make modern products feel reassuringly rooted. This was a fascinating inversion. The same industrial system that had once sold itself as escape from the past could later sell itself through the past. A food product could now promise both convenience and remembrance, both efficiency and emotional continuity. Modern life might be hurried and fractured, but the package could whisper that something familiar remained. At the same time, public health discourse became more insistent, though not always more coherent. Advice about fat, sugar, cholesterol, fiber, sodium, whole grains, and portion size evolved, sometimes sharply, over the decades. Consumers were told to fear one thing, then another, then perhaps both, then perhaps the larger pattern of highly processed eating itself. For ordinary people, this could be confusing rather than clarifying. The supermarket shelf was full of nutritional claims that seemed scientific, yet the overall dietary picture often remained murky. A product could boast vitamins, lower fat, fewer calories, added fiber, or heart-friendly language while still belonging to a broader system built for industrial convenience first and human flourishing only selectively. This is where the historical legacy of the 1950s continued to matter. The post-war years had taught Americans to trust the authority of packaging, labels, and institutional expertise in relation to food. Later generations did not simply abandon that habit when concerns emerged. Instead, they often sought reassurance through the same mechanisms: certifications, redesigned labels, new formulations, scientific language, marketing tied to wellness. The package had always been more than a container. It was an interpreter. And once a society becomes accustomed to having its food interpreted by industry, even critique can become another market segment. There were, of course, efforts to step outside this system. The counterculture, the natural foods movement, the revival of interest in whole grains, home gardening, farmers markets, organic farming, regional cuisines, and later local food campaigns all represented, in different ways, dissatisfaction with the industrial model. Some people wanted food that looked less manipulated, traveled shorter distances, or carried clearer ties to land and labor. Some objected to additives. Some sought environmental sustainability. Some pursued flavor. Others simply wanted a sense of reality back in the kitchen. Yet even these movements often coexisted with continued reliance on processed foods in daily life. The system was not easily escaped, because it had become a scaffold for modern routines. In fact, one of the quieter paradoxes of late 20th century American eating is that criticism of processed food often rose at the same time that processed food became even more indispensable. People might distrust additives, yet still depend on packaged school snacks. They might idealize fresh cooking, yet rely on frozen meals after work. They might speak warmly of farmers markets on weekends and still fill weekday cupboards with boxed and canned staples. This was not hypocrisy so much as evidence of how deeply the structure had settled in. Belief and practice were no longer perfectly aligned, if they ever had been. The workplace intensified that divide. Office culture, factory shifts, school timetables, hospital schedules, and service work all favored foods that could be eaten quickly, stored safely, and consumed with minimal ritual. Vending machines, packaged lunches, snack drawers, break room treats, and convenience store purchases became part of the texture of labor itself. The industrial food system did not simply meet workers at home after the day was done. It met them in the day, inside the rhythms of employment. The old model of meals prepared and eaten in slower, more bounded time was increasingly difficult to sustain under these conditions. This is worth remembering whenever the processed food story is reduced to a tale of bad choices. Industrial society has always had a strong appetite for food that behaves like industrial time. It must be punctual, stable, transportable, measurable, and ready on demand. The more society values those qualities in work and movement, the more food that embodies them will flourish. Seen this way, the processed food boom was not an accidental detour from modern America. It was one of the purest expressions of modern America's larger commitments. And yet expression is not destiny. The more widespread the system became, the more its contradictions sharpened. A country rich in food could be nutritionally confused. A society capable of enormous abundance could still produce forms of eating that felt rushed, lonely, or strangely detached from pleasure. Products designed to save time could coexist with a culture that always felt short of time. Foods that symbolized freedom from labor could depend on hidden labor elsewhere in the chain. And meals made easier by technology could leave many people with the sense that something less measurable had thinned out along the way. That thinning could take many forms. It might be the loss of a shared table. It might be the fading of regional recipes not easily industrialized. It might be the disappearance of skills once passed casually through generations. It might be the difficulty children had in recognizing ingredients outside their packaged forms. It might simply be the feeling that food had become another task to manage rather than an activity to inhabit. None of these losses were total, and none should be sentimentalized too crudely. But together they help explain why processed food, for all its practical triumphs, has so often carried an undertone of dissatisfaction. By the end of the 20th century and into the early 21st, that dissatisfaction would feed new kinds of argument. Journalists would begin tracing corporate consolidation in the food world. Researchers would examine the cumulative effects of heavily engineered diets. Activists would question school lunches. That is one of the subtler emotional foundations of processed food. Not greed, not necessarily indulgence, but contingency planning. A freezer full of prepared items, a cupboard lined with cans and boxes, a drawer full of quick snacks could feel like a defense against the instability of modern schedules. It meant there was always something, always a fallback, always a lunch component, always a dessert for the school event, something for the unexpected guest, something for the child who refused the main meal, something for the tired evening when nobody wanted to begin from raw ingredients. Industrial food systems turned uncertainty into stocked reassurance. Deserts, agricultural subsidies, and the marketing of sweetened products to children. Chefs would talk about ingredient quality and culinary degradation. Consumers would learn new phrases, some precise, some fashionable, to describe their unease. The conversation would become sharper, more politicized, and more fragmented all at once. One of the most influential newer framings would be the idea that certain foods were not just processed in the broad human sense, but processed to an extreme degree, assembled from extracted substances, refined inputs, flavor systems, and textures optimized for shelf life and habitual eating. That language would gain traction because it seemed to capture something older terms had missed. Americans had long known that bread, cheese, and canned tomatoes were processed. What many were now trying to name was a more intense form of industrial mediation. Foods designed less as preserved versions of familiar ingredients and more as deliberately engineered consumer products. And yet, even here, the ground had been prepared decades earlier. The acceptance of packaging as authority, the training of taste toward uniformity and instant reward, the alignment of domestic routine with industrial storage and reheating, the idea that food should solve time problems above all else, all of these had roots reaching back through the post-war years and especially into the great normalization of the 1950s. Later, vocabulary changed, but the historical path remained continuous. The country had not stumbled suddenly into a new food world. It had been led there, step by step, through systems that once felt almost unquestionably helpful. Which is why, as the national debate around food grew more intense, Americans found themselves in an unusually difficult position. They were trying to judge a system they had inherited not as outsiders, but as people whose kitchens, memories, workdays, and expectations had all been shaped by it. Reform could not simply mean removing a few products from the shelf. It raised deeper questions about labor, family time, corporate power, science, agriculture, childhood, and what a modern society is actually willing to ask of its eaters. And once those questions are opened seriously, the story moves beyond what was in the box or the can, toward the larger architecture of American life that made the box and the can feel, for so long, like the most reasonable answer available. That larger architecture of American life is what makes the processed food story so much more than a history of changing taste. It is, in the end, a history of what kind of society the United States built for itself after the war, and what kind of eating that society quietly required. Once food is asked above all to be portable, shelf-stable, predictable, cheap by the serving, safe in long chains of distribution, legible to children, adaptable to television, microwaves, lunchboxes, and late working hours, then the question is no longer why processed food became dominant. The question is how it could have been otherwise. This is where the moral simplicity that often surrounds the subject begins to fall away. It is easy, from a distance, to imagine that America merely lost its way, that it traded good food for bad food because corporations were persuasive and consumers were careless. But that version is too flat to be very useful. It misses the real force of the 1950s boom, which was not only that companies sold convenience aggressively, but that convenience matched the lived pressures of a country expanding outward, speeding up, and learning to trust large systems. Processed food succeeded because it was not absurd. It was often practical. It was practical enough, in fact, to become invisible. And invisibility may be the most powerful stage any system can reach. When a product is new, people discuss it. When it becomes common, they rely on it. When it becomes infrastructural, they scarcely notice it at all. By the time many Americans began speaking anxiously about food systems, additives, overprocessing, sugar, marketing to children, or the decline of cooking, they were already standing inside a nutritional and commercial environment that had been decades in the making. The pantry, the supermarket aisle, the school cafeteria, the vending machine, the gas station cooler, the office snack tray, the frozen food case, these were no longer separate curiosities. They formed a landscape. A landscape, once built, teaches people how to move through it. Consider something as ordinary as grocery planning. In an earlier age, buying food could be more closely tied to immediate need, seasonal supply, neighborhood access, and a sharper awareness of perishability. In the post-war and later 20th century model, grocery shopping became increasingly strategic in another sense. One bought for storage, for flexibility, for insurance against busyness, for the possibility that nobody would have time to cook later in the week. Shelf-stable soups, boxed pasta, cereal, crackers, canned vegetables, frozen entrees, powdered mixes, snack foods, and sweetened drinks were not only appetites in waiting. They were a hedge against disorder. And reassurance, once attached to food, is difficult to challenge with abstract criticism. A nutrition label may warn one thing. A doctor may advise another. A newspaper article may describe the dangers of over-reliance on highly engineered foods. But a parent standing in a supermarket at the end of a long workday is often managing a different logic altogether. They are not choosing in the abstract between ideology and science. They are choosing between options that can survive the week, fit the budget, satisfy the household, and reduce friction. This is where historical empathy matters. The American processed food story does not absolve the industry, but it also does not make ordinary consumers its simple accomplices. In fact, one of the most striking features of the later 20th century is how often consumers were simultaneously uneasy and dependent. They might mistrust artificial ingredients and still buy the family-sized package because it stretched further. They might want more fresh cooking and still rely on boxed shortcuts because the evening was short. They might criticize advertising aimed at children and still hand over the branded product because resistance itself required time and energy. The processed food environment did not merely offer temptations. It extracted small daily surrenders from people trying to manage real constraints. This is why the system could absorb so much critique without collapsing. If the underlying pressures remained the same, then reform at the level of packaging or messaging often changed less than it appeared to. A cereal could become whole grain. A frozen meal could become lean. A snack bar could be reframed as energy. Yogurt could become low-fat, then probiotic, then protein-rich, then low-sugar, with each adjustment sounding like a fresh chapter in nutritional wisdom. Yet the larger pattern persisted. Industrially designed foods continued to mediate between human schedules and human hunger. The language of reform also carried its own contradictions. When people called for a return to simpler eating, what exactly counted as simple? Bread baked at home? Vegetables bought fresh every few days? Soup simmered from scratch? A family dinner at a common hour? For some households, those things remained possible, though not always easy. For many others, they were ideals circulating in culture more often than realities supported by the structure of daily life. The romantic image of unprocessed eating could itself become a kind of aspiration product, easier to admire than to maintain. And yet the aspiration mattered. It signaled that something in the American relationship with food had become unsettled. If the 1950s had bathed processed food in optimism, later decades surrounded it with a more complicated emotional weather: nostalgia, guilt, dependence, criticism, fatigue, rebellion, and selective loyalty. People began sorting foods not just by taste or price, but by moral atmosphere. Some products felt suspect, others felt virtuous. Some seemed old-fashioned in a comforting way. Others seemed modern in a way that was now vaguely troubling. The supermarket became a place where Americans negotiated not just appetite, but conscience. One of the most revealing places to watch that negotiation was the school lunch. Here, many of the century's food transformations met each other in miniature. Nutrition policy, agricultural surplus, convenience, industrial contracting, child preference, cost control, and cultural anxiety all converged in a single tray. School meals had long been shaped by public policy and social need, but by the late 20th century they were increasingly entangled with the broader industrial food economy. Processed meats, reheated items, packaged desserts, sweetened dairy products, fries, pizza-like forms, and shelf-stable components became familiar features not simply because institutions were indifferent, but because they fit the logistical demands of feeding large numbers quickly and cheaply. There is a deeper irony here. The same society that worried about children's diets also organized many of its institutions around foods most compatible with industrial efficiency. Criticism often fell on parents or on children's supposed preferences, without fully grappling with the systems through which those preferences were cultivated and those meals delivered. Food history becomes most interesting when it refuses this easy personalization of structural problems. The lunch tray, like the pantry shelf, reflects much more than individual taste. It reflects procurement systems, labor budgets, refrigeration capacity, vendor contracts, and inherited assumptions about what practical feeding looks like in a modern mass society. The same could be said of hospitals, airlines, prisons, college cafeterias, and office catering. Again and again, the foods that prevailed were those that traveled well through institutions. Soft breads, processed meats, thickened sauces, portion-controlled desserts, shelf-stable beverages, frozen components, products that minimized uncertainty and maximized standardization gained enormous advantage. Once people grew accustomed to eating such foods in institutional settings, those same textures and expectations could feel familiar elsewhere. Industrial food was not just something Americans bought. It was something their workplaces, schools, and public systems repeatedly taught them to accept as normal. This normalization had another consequence that is often overlooked. It changed what counted as culinary skill. In earlier domestic regimes, skill might mean preserving, improvising, judging doneness without instruments, building flavor slowly, or making use of irregular ingredients. In the age of widespread processed food, skill often shifted toward management and assembly. One became skilled at using the right shortcuts, combining products efficiently, reading labels, stretching convenience foods economically, or producing acceptable results from packaged foundations. That is not fake skill. It is a different kind of skill, adapted to different pressures. But it does reveal how industry redefined competence without always announcing that it was doing so. Cookbooks and women's magazines of the post-war and late 20th century decades are full of this transition. Recipes routinely assumed the presence of canned soup, packaged pudding, cake mix, frozen vegetables, prepared dough, processed cheese, or box stuffing. The cook was still active, but now in partnership with industrial ingredients that had already performed much of the hidden labor. The finished dish could still signify care and occasion. This is part of why processed food embedded itself so deeply in family tradition. It was not always replacing ritual. Sometimes it became the ritual's raw material. Holiday tables show this especially clearly. Many dishes now associated with comfort or tradition in American households depend heavily on processed elements. Canned green beans, condensed soup, boxed fried onions, marshmallows, canned cranberry sauce, refrigerated dough, packaged broths, canned pumpkin. To dismiss these foods as merely artificial is to miss how they became woven into the emotional calendar of American life. They were industrial products, yes, but they arrived through repetition, and repetition is how tradition forms. A child who grows up seeing a ridged cylinder of cranberry sauce slide from the can each November may later remember that sight as sincerely as any older agrarian custom. This is one reason the processed food boom has been so difficult to narrate without either nostalgia or condemnation overwhelming the picture. It touched too many intimate layers of life to remain a purely economic story. It altered the texture of weekdays and holidays, the burden of motherhood, the marketing of childhood, the meaning of hospitality, the habits of institutions, and the sensory education of entire generations. To write its history responsibly means holding several truths at once. It reduced certain forms of labor. It expanded availability. It supported post-war domesticity. It helped corporations consolidate enormous influence. It normalized diets later linked to serious health concerns. It offered comfort. It obscured origins. It solved problems. Created others. By the time the language of food systems entered wider public conversation, Americans were already living with all of those truths at once. Investigative reporting, documentary films, public health campaigns, ingredient activism, anti-obesity programs, and consumer movements helped make the hidden chains behind food more visible. People learned to ask where things came from, how they were formulated, how children were marketed to, why certain ingredients were so ubiquitous, why some products were cheaper than fresher alternatives, and how agricultural policy shaped the whole arrangement. But visibility alone did not produce escape. Knowledge changed the cultural atmosphere around processed food more quickly than it changed the practical architecture of eating. And then the architecture became even more sophisticated. Data-driven marketing, nutritional segmentation, convenience store expansion, global supply chains, private label supermarket brands, endless flavor variation, and new categories of better-for-you processed products complicated the picture further. A shopper could now move through aisles lined not only with old-style convenience foods, but with foods designed to appear artisanal, premium, organic, gluten-free, protein-enriched, low-carb, heart-conscious, probiotic, plant-based, or minimally processed in spirit, even when they remained substantially shaped by industrial methods. The processed food system had learned not merely to endure criticism, but to metabolize it. This ability to metabolize criticism may be one of the strongest signs that the boom of the 1950s had become a permanent inheritance. Once an industrial order can absorb the values of its challengers and repackage them as new product lines, it has moved beyond simple dominance into cultural fluency. Speaks many dialects at once. It can address the hurried mother, the nostalgic grandparent, the gym-going professional, the environmentally concerned shopper, the child, the student, the frugal household, and the person who distrusts processed food but still needs dinner in 12 minutes. That does not mean all foods are equivalent or all choices meaningless. It means the system has learned to live inside contradiction. Even the renewed interest in home cooking, which has been significant in various waves, often unfolds in the shadow of industrial food culture. Home cooks may use meal kits, bottled sauces, pre-washed greens, prepared broths, spice blends, frozen vegetables, and partially assembled ingredients. The line between cooking and reheating, between craft and convenience, remains blurred. In some ways, this is a continuation of the compromise that defined the post-war era. Americans still want food that feels personal, but many also need systems that relieve them from beginning at zero. The box and the can have changed shape, but the underlying negotiation is remarkably familiar. And this returns us quietly to the meaning of the 1950s. That decade mattered not because it invented every relevant technology or because every American immediately abandoned older foodways. It mattered because it normalized a new contract between household and industry. The home would no longer be expected to perform all the hidden labor of feeding from scratch. Industry would take over much of that labor upstream, and in return Americans would reorganize their tastes, shopping patterns, kitchens, and expectations around the products that made such outsourcing possible. Once that contract settled in, every later debate about health, authenticity, labor, and convenience had to argue inside its terms. Which is why the processed food boom changed America forever in a way deeper than the shelf itself. It changed how Americans understood what a meal could legitimately be. It changed what counted as enough effort, enough freshness, enough care. It changed what institutions served, what children expected, what advertisers could assume, what farmers produced, what kitchens stored, and what kinds of hunger industry learned to anticipate. Later generations would challenge parts of that inheritance, and sometimes fiercely, but they would do so from within a country already shaped by the post-war decision to let modern food science, packaging, and mass distribution move permanently into the center of daily life. And once that center had shifted, the next question was no longer whether industrial food would remain part of the American story. It was what would happen when the country began trying, unevenly and often anxiously, to draw lines within that industrial abundance between what felt merely convenient and what now seemed to have gone too far. That effort to draw lines within industrial abundance became one of the defining food questions of modern America, because it revealed just how difficult it is to criticize a system without fully leaving it. By the late 20th century and into the early 21st, more Americans had begun to sense that not all processed foods belonged in the same category. Canned beans did not feel quite like fluorescent snack cakes. Frozen peas did not feel quite like engineered cheese crackers. Bread baked in a factory was not identical in cultural or nutritional imagination to a drink assembled from syrups, stabilizers, sweeteners, and color. The public was beginning, however imperfectly, to distinguish between degrees of processing, even if the language for doing so remained unstable. That instability mattered. Once a society realizes that it has perhaps been speaking too broadly about food, it often enters a long period of anxious sorting. People search for better terms, better labels, and better rules of thumb. They begin reading ingredient lists more closely. They grow suspicious of things that feel too smooth, too sweet, too durable, too bright, too detached from anything recognizably agricultural. But suspicion alone does not create clarity. It only creates a new mood, and moods can be commercially harvested. Food companies noticed that mood quickly. This is why the next phase of the story is not simply one of rebellion against processed food, but of classification, reclassification, and endless attempts to redraw the moral map of the supermarket. Terms like natural, wholesome, simple, clean, and real began to gather force, even though none of them were fully precise. A product could be sold as wholesome while still being heavily packaged and industrially distributed. It could be marketed as simple while relying on highly refined ingredients. It could look rustic, earthy, or old-fashioned while being the result of an elaborate modern supply chain. In other words, the line between reform and theater remained thin. Yet the desire behind these new categories was real. Many Americans were trying to recover something they felt had become obscured, a more direct relationship between food and recognition. If a food looked like an ingredient one might imagine growing, chopping, baking, or simmering, it seemed easier to trust. If it looked like a product engineered first for convenience and only second for nourishment, it invited unease. This did not always produce coherent decisions, but it did reveal a deeper cultural hunger for intelligibility. People wanted food that made sense to them again. This was, in a way, the reverse side of the 1950s boom. In the post-war decades, distance from production had often felt like progress. The modern home was not supposed to be burdened with every stage of food preparation. Industry would remove mess, uncertainty, spoilage, and time-consuming labor. But over generations, that very removal created a new discomfort. A country could become so successful at hiding the origins and transformations of food that consumers eventually felt estranged from what they were eating. The package still reassured, but now it could also conceal too much. One reason this feeling intensified is that the foods drawing the most criticism were often the ones that seemed designed less to satisfy hunger than to manipulate it. They were hyper-palatable, easy to overconsume, engineered to feel immediately rewarding, and often marketed with almost relentless emotional intelligence. Here, the older language of convenience began to look incomplete. A convenience food solves a practical problem. But some later products seem to solve a commercial problem first. How to keep the eater coming back, how to fit snacking into every idle moment, how to turn boredom, stress, reward, or distraction into another sale. The pantry had once stored backup meals. Now the whole environment seemed populated with edible temptations optimized for constant availability. This, perhaps more than any single ingredient, changed the emotional tone of the debate. Americans had long accepted foods that were canned, frozen, milled, sweetened, or preserved. But when foods began to feel less like durable provisions and more like engineered habits, the criticism sharpened. There was a difference, many sensed, between preserving peas for winter and manufacturing a neon-colored, shelf-stable dessert whose chief purpose was not necessity but irresistible repeat purchase. Of course, the boundary was never perfect. Still, the public mood was shifting from trust in industrial food as helper toward suspicion of industrial food as strategist. And strategy is the right word, because by now food companies were operating with immense sophistication. They studied consumer behavior, tested flavors, refined portion sizes, designed textures that produced specific sensory effects, and crafted packaging to communicate indulgence, restraint, health, or comfort in a matter of seconds. The old post-war faith that science would simply improve the dinner table had given way to a more uneasy recognition that science could also be used to intensify craving, extend shelf life beyond all intuitive expectation, and blur the difference between nourishment and product design. The laboratory had not disappeared from the food story. It had become even more central, only less romantic. That is partly why the newer language around ultra-processed foods resonated so strongly when it entered broader discussion. It gave people a term, however debated, for foods that seemed to belong to a different order from the older canned, frozen, or preserved staples they had long accepted. It suggested that the issue was not processing in the most basic historical sense, but an especially dense concentration of industrial intervention. Extracted inputs, reformulated textures, flavor systems, additives with technical functions, and products that no longer resembled conventional dishes so much as branded edible technologies. Whether or not every definition was precise, the term captured a growing public intuition that something had changed. But even here, the old American pattern remained. Once a category becomes culturally powerful, industry learns to position itself around it. Some products were reformulated. Others were marketed as minimally processed, or closer to whole foods, or free from ingredients consumers had grown wary of. Packaging became plainer, more earth-toned, more ingredient-forward. Companies discovered the commercial value of apparent transparency. The very anxiety produced by decades of industrial abundance could now be turned into a selling point. A simpler label became another form of design. This does not mean those changes were meaningless. Some genuinely did reduce certain additives or move products closer to recognizably basic ingredients. But it does remind us that the American food system remained structurally intact even as the rhetoric around it evolved. The shopper might feel that they were choosing against industrial food, while in many cases still selecting items deeply embedded in industrial agriculture, industrial logistics, industrial packaging, and industrial retail strategies. Reform, once again, was happening inside the inherited architecture rather than outside it. And that architecture had by now become global as well as national. American food culture, especially in its processed forms, traveled outward through brands, media, retail models, and fast food chains, even as ingredients and manufacturing practices flowed inward from a globalized economy. The processed food boom that had transformed America in the 1950s thus became part of a larger world history of standardized eating, corporate consolidation, and the spread of convenience-oriented food systems. But the United States remained a particularly influential case because it had pioneered so much of the emotional and commercial grammar. Abundance as virtue, convenience as liberation, packaging as trust, childhood as market, and technological intervention as a normal way of improving food. Within the United States, however, the distribution of this system was never equal. Processed food often became most entrenched where time was shortest, budgets were tightest, transport was limited, and institutional feeding was most common. In neighborhoods with fewer fresh options, in regions shaped by long commuting, in households where multiple jobs left little room for slow preparation, and in settings where cost per calorie mattered urgently, industrial food could seem not merely attractive but unavoidable. The food debate therefore increasingly intersected with class, geography, labor, and race, even when public conversations preferred to speak in universal moral language. That preference for moral language can obscure more than it reveals. It is easier to tell people to eat better than to redesign the time structure of work, the distribution of grocery access, the pricing of fresh produce, the quality of school lunches, or the availability of kitchens and storage. It is easier to shame a shopping basket than to ask why industrially produced calories became so cheap, so omnipresent, and so tightly linked to daily survival. The history of processed food becomes more honest when it stops treating the supermarket as a neutral arena of pure choice and instead sees it as the visible surface of much larger arrangements. This is why the processed food boom remained, long after the 1950s, a story about power. Not power in only the dramatic sense of scandal or conspiracy, though such things do appear in any large industry. More often it was the quieter power to define normality, the power to make certain ingredients ubiquitous, the power to shape official nutrition debates through lobbying or influence, the power to saturate childhood with brand familiarity, the power to turn food reform into a premium lifestyle option rather than a broadly accessible public good, the power to make speed look inevitable and slowness look luxurious. And yet the public was not powerless in return. Over time, consumer pressure did change labeling, shift menus, elevate some ingredients, and force at least partial responses from major companies. School lunch standards became contested political terrain. Sugar in beverages came under renewed scrutiny. Interest in local agriculture, whole foods, scratch cooking, and shorter ingredient lists reshaped parts of the market. The cultural prestige of some heavily processed foods declined, even if their sales remained strong. In many households, people began trying to improvise new compromises. Cooking more on weekends, relying on frozen vegetables rather than prepared side dishes, choosing some packaged foods but rejecting others, assembling meals from components that still save time without feeling entirely detached from ingredients. This compromise may be the most enduring theme of all. Americans rarely abandoned industrial food completely, just as they had rarely embraced it in only one pure form. Instead, they negotiated. They kept the canned tomatoes but questioned the snack cakes. They used frozen berries and pre-washed greens while feeling uneasy about sugary breakfast bars. They bought yogurt in small cups but tried to avoid certain additives. They cooked dinner 3 nights a week and reheated packaged meals on 2 others. They oscillated between aspiration and fatigue, principle and practicality. The national diet, in other words, remained a patchwork of inherited systems and selective resistance. There is something quietly revealing in that patchwork. It suggests that the true legacy of the 1950s processed food boom was not merely a set of products, but a set of habits of mind. Americans learned to think of food as something that could be improved, accelerated, stabilized, portioned, fortified, frozen, boxed, microwaved, reformulated, and marketed to solve the pressure of ordinary life. Later generations learned to question some of those solutions, but rarely the deeper assumption that food must adapt itself to whatever rhythms modern life demands. That assumption remains one of the strongest invisible inheritances of the post-war era. If you look closely, you can still see the old post-war promise flickering underneath even the newest food trends. Meal replacement drinks promise efficiency. High-protein bars promise controlled nourishment on the move. Prepared, refrigerated meals promise freshness without labor. Delivery apps promise freedom from planning. Even the language changes, but the underlying desire remains recognizable. Less time, less mess, less uncertainty, less interruption. Industry, as it did in the 1950s, continues to answer that desire with products and systems designed to remove friction. The tools are newer. The logic is remarkably familiar, and perhaps that is the quietest historical twist in the whole story. The foods that once symbolized the future did not simply age into quaint mid-century artifacts. They taught America how to desire a certain kind of relationship with eating, one based on delegation. Let someone else measure, preserve, formulate, and prepare in advance. Let the household open, heat, arrange, and consume. That delegation was once experienced as relief. Later, it also came to feel like dependence. But the structure held. Each new generation inherited not just the pantry, but the expectation that food should arrive already halfway solved. This helps explain why the story retains such emotional charge. To criticize processed food can sound, at times, like criticizing modern life itself. It raises awkward questions. If meals should be less engineered, who will do the extra work? If ingredients should be fresher, who will shop more often? If childhood should be less branded, who will resist the market everywhere else? If food should be more local, who will pay the higher price or endure the narrower season? These are not arguments against reform. They are reminders that the industrial diet became powerful because it answered real burdens, even when it answered them imperfectly. That is why the history remains unfinished. America has not resolved its relationship with processed food. It still moves between trust and suspicion, memory and critique, convenience and regret. It still argues over school meals, food labeling, advertising to children, ingredient transparency, public health, and the social cost of expecting every household to solve structural problems at the dinner table. The old optimism of the 1950s has faded, but the systems built in that decade still shape what feels easy, normal, affordable, and even imaginable. And as those arguments continue, one question hangs over the whole story with unusual persistence. After decades of learning to eat through industrial design, could Americans meaningfully change their food culture without changing the tempo, inequality, and everyday pressures of the society that made processed food feel so indispensable in the first place? That question lingers because it reaches beyond food and into the design of everyday American time. A society may criticize what is on the plate, but if it leaves untouched the exhaustion, commuting, fragmented schedules, childcare pressures, wage instability, and institutional habits surrounding the plate, then the old industrial logic tends to return by another door. The package may look cleaner. The ingredient list may shorten. The branding may borrow the language of wellness rather than modern science. But the deeper demand remains the same. Make eating compatible with a life that feels overstructured and undernourished at once. This is where the history of processed food becomes unexpectedly intimate. For all the talk of additives, agriculture, and corporations, the story keeps leading back to ordinary fatigue. A person does not stand in a grocery aisle as a purely rational evaluator of nutritional systems. They stand there at the end of a day, or in the middle of a rushed weekend, carrying the weight of a budget, a family routine, a set of cravings, a memory of what children will refuse, a hope to waste nothing, and often a quiet desire not to think too hard for just a moment. Industrial food has always understood that moment very well. It has flourished not simply by shaping appetite, but by meeting tiredness with solutions that feel merciful. The mercy, however, has always been double-edged. What relieves labor today may help normalize the structure that creates too much labor tomorrow. The more households learn to rely on foods that save time, the easier it becomes for the wider society to assume that time need not be made available elsewhere. Employers do not set shorter days because frozen meals exist, of course. But the cultural tolerance for overburdened schedules is subtly reinforced when food can be made to cooperate with them. A nation of quick breakfasts, desk lunches, snack-based afternoons, and reheated dinners may begin to treat those rhythms as ordinary rather than costly. That is one reason reformers who focus only on ingredients often run into frustration. To say that Americans should eat less processed food is, at one level, to speak about chemistry, packaging, and public health. But at another level, it is to ask whether people can reclaim time-intensive forms of care inside a culture that does not distribute time generously. Cooking from scratch, shopping more frequently, teaching children to eat differently, resisting convenience marketing, and rebuilding mealtime rituals all require not just information, but space. And space in modern societies is unequally held. The processed food boom of the 1950s concealed this inequality for a while by presenting convenience as broadly democratizing. In many real ways, it allowed households without servants, expansive family support, or endless domestic hours to achieve forms of abundance once more difficult to maintain. It reduced certain burdens. It offered practical flexibility. Those gains mattered. Yet over time, as criticism of industrial diets intensified, a new divide emerged. The ability to resist some processed foods could itself become a kind of privilege. Freshness, slowness, ingredient awareness, artisanal quality, local sourcing, and leisure-heavy cooking all began, in some settings, to signal not only moral seriousness but access. Access to time, transport, money, equipment, knowledge, and more stable daily rhythms. This made the politics of food unusually delicate. If industrial food had once been celebrated as modern liberation, its later critics sometimes risked sounding as though they were asking ordinary families to solve structural imbalances through personal discipline alone. That did not mean the critique was wrong. It meant it had to become more sophisticated. Food history, when done carefully, refuses the comforting fantasy that better choices float free of social conditions. It asks what kinds of conditions make certain choices feel feasible, respectable, and sustainable in the first place. Seen this way, one of the most enduring achievements of the processed food industry was not merely its control over products, but its influence over the definition of practicality. Practical food came to mean food that lasted, traveled, reheated, portioned, and survived neglect. It meant food that could wait in the freezer, remain stable in the cupboard, or emerge quickly from a wrapper without much preparation. That definition once answered very real needs. The difficulty is that it became so entrenched that alternatives could appear impractical almost by nature, even when their impracticality was historically produced rather than inevitable. Take the notion of the family dinner, often invoked in American culture with a mix of longing and instruction. It has been treated as a symbol of stability, moral order, and healthy social development. Yet the capacity to hold such a dinner regularly depends on synchronized schedules, adequate space, manageable work hours, and enough emotional energy for preparation and shared time. Processed food did not destroy the family dinner on its own. In many homes, it helped sustain it by making some version of supper possible under pressure. But it also made another arrangement easier. The meal assembled quickly, eaten on the run, or broken into individualized components according to preference and timetable. That individualized eating pattern, which grew more common over time, should not be dismissed as simple decay. It reflected real diversification in daily life. Family members moved through different schools, jobs, shifts, activities, and commutes. The shared table became harder to coordinate. Industry adapted beautifully to that fragmentation. Foods could now be tailored by person and occasion. One child might want a certain snack, another a microwavable meal, an adult a diet-branded yogurt, another adult leftovers extended with packaged sides. The household no longer needed to revolve around a single dish at a single hour. Convenience made pluralism possible, but also made collective rhythm less necessary. And once collective rhythm weakens, food changes character. It becomes less of an event and more of a flow. A thing taken when needed, opened, sipped, unwrapped, reheated, eaten in transit, consumed while working, finished in front of a screen. This did not begin with the 21st century, of course. The television dinner and the lunchbox had already pointed in this direction. But later decades intensified it. Snacking culture, grazing, beverage calories, portionable convenience foods, and the disappearance of strong boundaries between meals all helped create a diet that moved with the body rather than gathering the body around it. In that environment, industrial foods possessed a built-in advantage over traditional patterns. They were designed for interruption. They survived half attention. They tolerated delay. They required little sensory patience. One did not need to wait for ripeness, or simmering, or rising dough, or cooling soup. The product arrived ready for a distracted world. If one wanted a single phrase to explain why processed food retained its strength long after criticism mounted, it might be this: it was exquisitely suited to interrupted living. Interrupted living has a history of its own. It belongs to the expansion of office work, service labor, car dependency, digital distraction, late capitalism, and the broader tempo of modern life. As these forces deepened, they made many of the old virtues associated with cooking more difficult to inhabit casually. Patience, attention, sequence, seasonality, leftovers managed carefully, bulk preparation from basic ingredients, skills learned gradually over years. All of these became harder to maintain as routine habits rather than intentional projects. When people did recover them, they often experienced them as chosen practices, even forms of resistance, not simply as the default structure of life. This helps explain why food media changed so dramatically. Cookbooks, television cooking shows, magazines, later websites, and social platforms all began addressing an audience at once hungry for authenticity and trapped in convenience. Recipes grew bifurcated. Some leaned into fantasy, comfort, craftsmanship, or regional revival. Others emphasized speed, shortcuts, meal prepping, 5-ingredient solutions, and ways to approximate home cooking without surrendering too much time. In both cases, the industrial food legacy remained visible. Even the desire to cook properly often took shape against the backdrop of a processed food world that had defined what counted as effort-saving. There is a deeper irony here. The more processed food took over the burden of everyday feeding, the more cooking itself could become symbolically elevated. It became not just necessity, but hobby, identity, therapy, performance, aspiration, even luxury. A person might spend hours cooking on a weekend and still depend heavily on industrial foods during the workweek. This split would have been less legible in an earlier era, when cooking was more fully embedded in survival and household repetition. In the modern United States, however, the practical and the symbolic functions of cooking increasingly drifted apart. Processed food handled the weekday infrastructure. Real cooking could then become a special zone of meaning. That specialness helped fuel new forms of nostalgia. Americans began looking backward, sometimes romantically, toward farm tables, grandmother kitchens, old-fashioned baking, and recipes from scratch, as though these things existed in a calm world outside pressure. History, of course, offers a corrective. Earlier food systems were not necessarily gentler. They demanded heavy labor, skill under constraint, adaptation to scarcity, and endless repetitive work, much of it borne by women. But nostalgia does not need perfect truth to exert power. It only needs emotional contrast. And industrial food, by making ordinary eating feel increasingly abstract and managed, gave nostalgia ample room to grow. The strange result was that American culture ended up preserving two contradictory longings at once. One longing was for convenience, simplicity in the sense of reduced labor, food that would not ask too much. The other was for authenticity, simplicity in the sense of fewer intermediaries, more visible ingredients, more recognizable preparation, perhaps more communal meaning. These are not the same simplicity at all. In fact, they often pull in opposite directions. The history of processed food after the 1950s is, in many ways, the history of Americans trying to reconcile them and rarely quite succeeding. Industry became adept at profiting from both desires simultaneously. A product could be marketed as wholesome and time-saving, rustic and efficient, ancestral in inspiration yet modern in packaging. Frozen meals could promise chef quality. Snack bars could promise ancient grains. Yogurts could promise purity in elegantly minimalist cups. Refrigerated dough could promise homemade warmth with minimal effort. Such products did not erase the contradiction between authenticity and convenience. They domesticated it, making it feel manageable enough to purchase. Still, there remained moments when the underlying tension became harder to smooth over. Public health data accumulated. Rates of diet-related disease became more difficult to ignore. Researchers probed the relationship between heavily engineered foods and patterns of consumption. Journalists traced the marketing tactics aimed at children. Critics began speaking not only about individual responsibility but about the systemic saturation of everyday life with profitable, industrially optimized food choices. The older post-war innocence around the laboratory and the package could no longer hold in the same way. Even people who continued relying on processed foods often did so with a more uneasy awareness. This uneasy awareness shaped the culture of labeling. Facts panels, ingredient disclosures, calorie counts, front-of-package health claims, clean label marketing, and later smartphone-enabled scrutiny all turned the act of buying food into a more interpretive exercise. Yet, interpretation itself became labor. The consumer was now expected not only to shop, budget, transport, store, and serve, but also to decode claims, compare formulations, anticipate hidden sugars or sodium, and navigate conflicting expert advice. In a sense, some of the labor once removed from the kitchen had returned in the form of cognitive burden. The processed food system offered convenience at the stove while often increasing complexity in the aisle. That burden did not fall equally. People with more education, time, and confidence in reading labels could navigate it differently from those simply trying to feed a family fast and cheaply. Once again, the food question revealed social stratification not just in what people ate, but in how much mental bandwidth they could devote to managing food choices. A society that prides itself on consumer choice often forgets that choice itself can become exhausting when every option comes with hidden trade-offs. For this reason, some of the strongest critics of American food culture eventually turned away from focusing only on the individual consumer and toward the wider system. The subsidies that favored certain crops, the institutional contracts that rewarded shelf-stable and reheatable meals, the zoning and retail patterns that shaped access, the labor market that compressed household time, the marketing budgets that made certain products omnipresent, and the public health environment that left families to improvise solutions on their own. This shift in critique was important because it brought the story back, at last, to something the 1950s boom had always concealed behind its cheerful packaging. The industrial diet was built, not merely chosen. And if it was built, then its continuance also depended on maintenance. Warehouses, refrigerated transport, factory standardization, agricultural monocultures, chemical preservation, supermarket architecture, media advertising, and the deep habits of household expectation all had to keep working together. This is where food history overlaps with the history of infrastructure in the broadest sense. Americans learned to trust the fact that food would always be there, in stable form, across seasons and distances, at late hours and in endless combinations. Such trust is one of modernity's great comforts. It is also one of its most fragile illusions, because it obscures how many systems must remain intact to make convenience look natural. The old mid-century promise had been that technology would free the household from uncertainty. In many respects, it did. But by removing certain older uncertainties, it introduced a newer kind, dependence on long, opaque chains of production and distribution that ordinary consumers could scarcely see, let alone influence. For decades, that dependence remained mostly background noise. The shelves stayed full. The package remained reliable. The freezer hummed. The microwave worked. The meal appeared. Yet as the 21st century advanced, and as disruptions, shortages, cost shifts, and renewed public debates around food resilience became more visible, Americans were forced, at least intermittently, to look again at the underlying architecture that the 1950s had helped normalize. And that is where the story begins to open into its next chapter, because once people start asking not only what is in their food, but how their entire food world is organized, the conversation moves from nutrition and nostalgia towards something larger and more unsettling. Whether a society built on speed, abundance, and process convenience can still imagine a different way of feeding itself without first reimagining the pace and priorities of everyday life. Whether a society built on speed, abundance, and process convenience can still imagine a different way of feeding itself without first reimagining the pace and priorities of everyday life is, in many ways, the final question left behind by the processed food boom that transformed America in the 1950s. Because the deeper truth of this history is that the boom was never just about cans, freezers, cereals, snack foods, frozen dinners, or brightly printed boxes on supermarket shelves. It was about a bargain. A modern industrial nation offered to take over more of the hidden labor of feeding its people, and in return its people gradually agreed to let industry move further and further into the intimate routines of the home. At first, that bargain felt almost miraculous. It relieved burdens that had been real. It made certain forms of abundance more widely available. It gave families tools that felt practical, modern, and hopeful. It fit a country emerging from depression and war into confidence, productivity, suburban expansion, and faith in technology. For millions of Americans, processed food was not a foolish choice. It was a reasonable answer to the conditions of the time. That is important to remember, because history becomes shallow when it mocks the people who lived inside systems that made sense before their costs were fully visible. But over time, the very success of that bargain changed the national diet so thoroughly that Americans began to lose sight of what had happened. Food became more stable, more portable, more branded, more uniform, and more dependent on invisible chains of chemistry, packaging, transport, advertising, and institutional trust. Meals became easier to assemble, yet often more detached from ingredients, seasonality, locality, and older domestic skills. The kitchen became more efficient, but also more reliant. The supermarket became a symbol of abundance, but also a place where industry interpreted food on behalf of the eater. And perhaps that is the most revealing irony of all. The processed food revolution was sold as a way to simplify life, and in one sense it truly did. It simplified labor, it simplified storage, it simplified planning under pressure. But in the longer view, it also created a new complexity. Americans inherited a food world in which they had to sort constantly between convenience and health, between memory and criticism, between what felt affordable and what felt responsible, between what saved time and what quietly reshaped taste, habit, and expectation. The country did not simply eat more industrial food. It learned to organize daily life around the assumption that food should arrive already partly solved. that assumption still lingers. It is there in the quick breakfast, the frozen aisle, the packaged lunch, the ready-made snack, the meal replacement, the bottled promise of health, the delivery app, the supermarket shelf designed to remove friction from tired evenings. Even the modern backlash against processed food often takes place inside systems first made normal in the post-war years. Americans may debate labels, ingredients, additives, and ultra-processing now with far more suspicion than their grandparents did. But the structure built in the 1950s still shapes what feels practical, affordable, and ordinary. So the real legacy of the processed food boom is not only nutritional or commercial. It is cultural. It changed what Americans thought a meal could be. It changed what counted as enough effort, enough care, enough modernity, enough convenience. It changed childhood, advertising, farming, shopping, domestic labor, public health debates, and even nostalgia itself. It taught a nation to trust food that came mediated through science and packaging, and later forced that same nation to reckon with what had been gained, what had been lost, and what had simply become too deeply woven into modern life to remove cleanly. And that may be why this history still feels strangely close. It is not safely tucked away in the 1950s with chrome kitchens, pastel advertisements, and tidy suburban optimism. It is in the habits that survived them. It is in the pantry. It is in the school lunch. It is in the office break room, the long commute, the late supper, the child asking for a branded favorite, the adult trying to read a label while thinking about 3 other things at once. The story endured because the systems endured, and because the pressures that first made processed food attractive never entirely disappeared. In many cases, they only intensified. If there is a lasting lesson here, it may be a quiet one. People do not eat in the abstract. They eat inside the shape of their society. They eat through its technologies, its work patterns, its assumptions about family, its forms of inequality, its visions of progress, and its willingness or unwillingness to leave room for time-consuming care. The processed food boom changed America forever, not because Americans suddenly forgot what food was, but because modern America taught them to need food that could keep pace with the world it had built. And so, when we look back at the bright promises of the 1950s, at the canned soups, the cake mixes, the frozen meals, the fortified cereals, the soft factory bread, and all the rest, we are not looking at a trivial chapter in consumer history. We are looking at a moment when the future moved into the kitchen and stayed there. If one detail from this whole story surprised you most, or if there is one part of that world you think people today most misunderstand, I'd be genuinely interested to hear it. And if you'd like more calm, thoughtful history like this, you're very welcome to subscribe and come back for the next journey into the past.